thank you very much to our speakers for their kind of contributions. We've got ourselves a period of about, I guess, 45 minutes or so for Q&A, for discussion. I know that James has to be off by at least 4:15, so that will bring us to a natural close when members of the panel start leaving. That's normally a sign. uh, but that certainly gives us plenty of scope for discussion. And there's also a line on the agenda which talks explicitly about next steps. What should we do next? What's the purpose? What can we take out of this that would require further work? So as we were leaving it, Herman had given us a kind of conversation piece, a presentation about his work and his cost models. We never really got an opportunity to follow up on any kind of direct questions, any kind of specific matters of fact for Herman. So I wanted to, if it's okay, Herman, just start in a sense by kind of continuing that discussion a wee bit, but to try and do it in a way that engages everyone else. Now, what's striking to me is, if I'm right, Herman, in the morning and up till kind of lunchtime, we heard a great deal from universities. We heard research data management very strongly represented. James obviously talking at the National Archives about the commercial value of archives and broader cultural kind of sector, and I think that's also true of the institutions you were showing us as well. So there's a kind of interesting dialogue by default from our presentations about the relationship between the tools in a university context and in other cultural contexts. So I wonder if I could explore that a little bit. Maybe invite you specifically to ask, am I right that there were no universities in your kind of framework there? Are they coming in at some point? Are there reasons why they're not part of the network? Just invite that kind of thought.
I hope that they're coming in at some point.
Yep.
But they're really, not willing. Yeah, they have other issues.
Yes.
Why not cooperating with our model? I've made a detour in our country to persuade the university to participate, but they are a little bit scary about that their costs are on the streets.
Yes.
That's scary.
Yep.
So what you saw in my presentation was that the results are anonymous. They are, with some background, you can figure it out. But that's one of our things. Not everybody is willing to show their cost information to the public. It's scary. It's to do with finance because it's very easy to say, for instance, a National Archive of the Netherlands has, where you were starting with, cost 120 euros per terabyte. I does it for 100, so I is much cheaper, can do it better. That's a really bad comparison. My arguments are of my story is that you must look at the context of the institution to compare to analyze the cost, and then have a discussion about where can we benefit from each other, which can we learn, and then start a conversation about that.
Yep.
And it's very dangerous to compare it on the level you have shown at the beginning.
Yeah, which is why I didn't want anyone to quote that or tweet it.
That's really good, but that's all. But that's one argument why institutions are scary about showing their cost figures.
So maybe I can invite others to comment on that then. I mean, there is a basis for sharing information, a basis for comparison, but it's obviously a basis that has a couple of limitations around it, So there'll be different experiences, not just in terms of the function, the kind of the business areas represented by an archive or a university, but there's also kind of cultural expectations which are variable too.
Yeah, that also, but what also is at the beginning of our conference, we had it, we topic benefits.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a lot better to discuss what the benefits are.
Yeah.
About finance, which also Neil argumented, than finance on costs.
Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, I wonder if I could bring others in on that sort of thought then. I mean, the lessons learned, say, from, Neil, and your own kind of work of keeping research data safe. There's a family of institutions that you've been working with, research institutions by and large. I mean, what's the limit of what we can extract from that to other, to HSBC or to other types of institution that might be interested in using some of those tools in other contexts?
I think it's partly coming back to this, what's the purpose of the cost models? And I was interested when Herman was presenting, because you gave the insight, compare and forecast. And for me, the really important things are the first and the third. And I still have reservations about comparing institution to institution because of those contextual things, even within the same sector. But I think they all benefit from sharing their data and from the insights and the forecasting parts of it. So if we can develop the tools that we have,
Yep.
the data sets we have to do that, that strikes me as something which would be very valuable. Something else that I suppose occurred to me, maybe slightly off theme, it's very much around also thinking about obsolescence of the data sets, if I could put it that way. When we're comparing, there's going to be a time creep coming into some of those data sets. So you've got to be very careful about that. At which point does it no longer make sense to compare one data set with another because there's something that has happened in that period. And again, Herman, you made a very interesting observation, I think, about infrastructure and the way that people are now, because a lot of them are outsourcing infrastructure and services, the externalization service cost is appearing in the infrastructure bit. And that's a big change from, say, 10 years ago. And I think there's a lot of interest, perhaps, in looking as a research issue around some of those externalized costs, because I think it's not just a storage saving. Potentially there are staff savings in there as well, that some of the skills and the people that you'd have to employ otherwise would be there. And I think that's an interesting research issue as to whether some of the benefits of cloud, which are all claimed and generic, but are they actually being realised? It would be an interesting issue. The other thing which is linked to this is also to what extent are we trying to build up time series of the cost data? Because certainly in KRDS, one of the key things was the archaeology data service, which is the only one where we could look at comparative costs annually over a 10-year or longer period. That was really rare. And I think deliberate attempts to build up more of a regular deposit of those costs and then being able to compare them over time and what's changing them would be very valuable. So there are ways where I think we've got to be very careful about comparing, but where we could switch the focus a bit, I think would actually be very valuable for institutions.
Can I bring Matilda?
Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sarah, you do your thing. Matilda, get.
Mine's quick, I promise. Building on that context idea and needing to know the context and the variables that come along with every different organisation type. One of the things that the CCX tried to do was not just kind of present the cost data for comparison's sake, just kind of like numbers with numbers kind of thing, but was to encourage a conversation. So you would be able to do a peer-to-peer comparison with what it would select for you as the most similar, which was based on all sorts of kind of things that I don't understand, but it would select a similar organisation which it would compare your data with, but you could also select from a list of other organisations that had chosen to make themselves kind of visible. But it also allowed the conversation to take place then. So you could contact that organisation if you were interested in knowing a bit more about how on earth they'd got to that when yours was so, like that. So you maybe the eye and the sound and vision. Sorry, I wasn't going to try and attempt the touch. The sound and vision example. So you might look at that on first glance and think, what on earth is that all about? But the CCX would enable that sort of conversation to take place and those factors to be considered more carefully and the context to be established. But then, maybe like for like is good. Maybe like with something completely different is good because it kind of enables different approaches to be identified and shared and adopted and things. Just, I think what I'm getting at is that it was more than just the comparison itself. It was about starting a conversation.
Paul, could we get Matilda?
I was quite interested to hear more actually about what you think the role of the vendors are in this conversation, because they are a big driver of cost. They set a lot of our costs, and it is, as you mentioned, there has been a real growth in the involvement and the outsourcing to vendors, whether you're on premise or if you're using more cloud-based solutions. I think surely the vendors are actually in a really good place to put some insight on this, because they work with such a broad variety of organisations using a very similar product but in lots of different ways. Do you have any thoughts on that and how that can be developed necessarily?
Do you know, that's a brilliant question, Matilda. We will put this to the panel directly, but let's make a note of that for Digital Preservation Futures in Dublin in July, where we're getting the vendors together and we've got an opportunity to grill them as a panel. But anyway, that doesn't get these guys off the hook. Who'd like to have a thought on the role of us to understand vendors?
See, I'm going to be CCX all the way here, but as part of the development of that tool and as part of the 4C project in total, kind of in its entirety, we had a whole kind of board of advisors and stakeholders, and there were vendors on that within that group who were able to sort of provide their insights. So that was one way that we sort of tried to gather that, and I mean it didn't necessarily, it doesn't help you particularly because it doesn't kind of drive down a cost or anyway, but they were involved in the conversation and they were happy to be part of that conversation. They wanted to be part of that conversation, I think is important. But also to say that vendors have submitted costs to the CCX as well. And so, storage costs and things are all kind of part, that they've contributed that. And as far as I'm aware, they are publicly, you can see what they are. They've made their information visible. I was going to say something else, because we've recently held a webinar series on the digital preservation futures, and where all of our DPC supporter vendors have kind of presented us with their latest kind of offerings and things. And what was quite interesting was that each of them kind of had, they had interesting things to say about advocacy and advocating for digital preservation within their organisations. And a lot of them came at it from a commercial point of view. So what I want to do is kind of capture that, harness it and feed it back into the community forum again, which will be made available to DPC members. But yeah, that was just a kind of side thought.
One of the thoughts to bring to that, if I may, you're right about the vendor's involvement in CCX, and in fact it was a vendor that built the CCX, if you were to include Keep Solutions from Portugal as a vendor. But since that was built, the vendor market for digital preservation has really changed. It's really expanded. There are many, many more vendors in the marketplace, and they're offering a wider range of solutions, and there's a greater emphasis on that commodity cloud provision. So I suspect actually it's worth going back and doing another look at that in due course, and trying to track how that also has changed.
Thank you.
Herman?
One note, in Holland, or in the Netherlands, vendors are part of the network for the digital architecture, yes, DOA 2.0 we have developed in the network. Vendors have committed to further development of that project. So they were a part of the network. in the discussion of cost, I think for an institution it is very wise that you have insight in your costs, so you can compare it with the offer from the vendor. From is it wise to go to the vendor, or it's maybe cheaper to do it yourself. So it's also part of you know, what also Sarah said. Yeah, commercial activities. Is it worth to go to the vendor or not?
Paul, you were wanting to ask a question yourself.
So I just wanted to go back to the comments about comparison between one organisation and another using the costs. And so there was a bit of criticism for that, a bit of scepticism about doing that. But I think if you just compare the costs, then yes, what the criticisms that were made were valid. But I think what's really important to capture in a cost model is exactly what the activities are. So if one organisation is paying twice as much for storage as another, there's probably a reason for that. It's not necessarily that it's costing them more and they're being much less efficient. That could be the answer. The answer could be that they store more copies, that their video that they store is much higher quality. There could be very genuine reasons behind that.
Yep.
So I think it's particularly important that you try and capture that detail behind the sort of headline activity that might be ingest, it might be storage, it might be whatever, and to present that alongside the costs to illustrate why there might be a difference between those costs. I can see Neil wants to come back.
Yeah, I was just going to agree entirely with that, Paul. And I think that's one of the other things I was going to add. As I think the other thing which interested me about Herman's presentation was around cost drivers. And that's a really interesting thing, I think, to dig down into is when you're looking at costs, what is changing the difference in costs between different institutions. That's levels and quality, but there are other things as well. People understand which levers they're pulling really change their costs. That's a very important thing to share and to understand. And I think one thing I hadn't understood before was the number of data sets in the curation, in the 4C data sets, 240. That's a really wonderful resource to have. Certainly for KRDS, I think we were having to work with about 13 to 17. Sounds like in the Netherlands, you're still wanting to get to that critical mass about. Yeah. So I think there's a real opportunity there for digging into that as a resource.
Yep.
And looking for ways that we compare it slightly differently, as I said. I think those sort of ways of giving people indicators of forecasting, ways of helping them to understand the big changes in costs, the levers in that data, rather than per se, avoiding simplistic comparison between one organisation and another. I'm sure you're not doing that, but to try and go beyond that effectively in that way would be really good.
I agree completely. Having said we need to present the detail of the activity alongside the costs, I think there's a real challenge in doing that. And that's what many of the previous cost modelling activities found, that you can either go quite high level, in which case you have little detail and then it's a sort of a meaningless comparison, as you noted, or you can go really detailed, but then you have a really complex cost model and that puts people off using it, and then you just can't get enough data in. And finding the sweet spot in the middle is really difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why we've ended up with so many different cost models, because each time we come to this problem, we look at it and we look at what's out there and go, well, we're not really happy with that model. We're not happy with this one. Let's develop something new, even if we're building it on previous work. So, I don't know, this sounds perhaps like a little bit of a challenge to Herman, but actually I think it's a challenge to everyone in this room and everyone out there. We need to settle on a model, okay? So one of the things that I did, so that the blog post that Sarah mentioned wrote back in 2012, one of the things I was doing then was tracking all the different cost models that this field was coming up with. And I can't remember what number it got up to, but it was 15 or 20. It was like way too many for this field to be able to afford to produce. Never mind do the cost modelling to actually produce all these cost models. And there's been a lot more since. So I think we need to just settle on one. Okay, so the thing that Neil talked about being really, really useful, and I completely agree with him on this, is to be able to model costs over time, to be able to track how they change and how we develop and how we move forward. But we can't do that if we keep using new cost models, because then you can't compare between them. So we really need to settle on one. Maybe that's Herman's. Maybe
Yeah, I was going to say,
in a way, I don't think I care. I think we just need to
I
settle on one.
totally agree with you, Paul. But one thing I remember from the 3 years I've worked now for Dutch Heritage Network is not every institution understands the concept of costs. So my colleague and I, we traveled around our country to help every institution by filling in and asking questions about how does the cost, what are the cost drivers. It's almost impossible, also for the cost model I have presented yet, to fill it in by the institution itself. There is a couple, you need assistance from, in our case, the Dutch network of Dutch Heritage Network. So we travel around to help the institutions. That really helps them also to understand those cost concepts are really complicated, but it's not always a story of only the Department of Finance. It's also a story of preservation. It's also a story of direction. And when our cost model was also a tool for them to settle down, discuss what they have filled in, and analyze what the results are, and thought about it from strange. We didn't know that, so we can make another decision about it. So it's just more than filling in the model. It's a whole process about another way of thinking, but also about strategic decision making and what do you need to make a good strategic decision making. And I think I totally agree with you, Paul. We should have less cost models, but I think we should think about how can we help institutions understand the concept of cost, and then filling in the concept of the cost model. And what I try to explain in my presentation, there's a great difference about maturity along institutions about enabling to fill in the cost model. Most of the institutions on my list are big institutions who have a lot of people who can have time to fill it in. If the institution is really small and run by people with most of passion for the collection, they don't care about cost. It is important, but it's not where their heart is. Yep. And that makes, so this year we get from the Dutch Heritage Network, we're going to invest on helping those small institutions about this point.
I think it's that engagement that you've made with all those institutions that's been a huge step forward in this bit of work. I think you've really demonstrated the value in doing that, as you described, and that really has moved things forward.
It seems to me like some of the conversation about cost modelling is actually just an opportunity to have a conversation, and having that conversation can almost be as important in terms of kind of developing outcomes.
I was just going to add one thing, which perhaps we ought to make explicit as well, was this, when talking about cost models, important to realise that you need the data for them. So it's not only about adopting a cost model, it means all the staff also time logging against a cost model. And most institutions don't log their time in that way. And even if they sample, it's a big commitment to do that. So it's something to bear in mind that there's a change in practice, presumably in the KB now, which is allowing them, through having a different time recording system, for the staff to get those numbers.
Not just timing, but also...
Can you pass the mic, please, Neil? Thanks.
Not just time, but also the administration of cost is based on our cost model. So the system works for the KB, and not the KB is not working for the system. Which when I come with my model, they have to settle down, think about it. Now they push on the button and have all the costs allocated against the activities in our cost model. So that's a lot easier. But that's also a problem there. When the financial architecture is different from the model, they have to settle down and make a decision about how to divide some costs. And that's when I come back to what you said in your presentation, Neil.
So I wonder if I could bring James into the conversation a little bit, because James, you were very hot on the value and how do we establish the value in a kind of market sense. The conversation about costs must just kind of push that even further away, because it's been hard to establish that value. And here we are talking about what all the costs will be, and it does just sound like data or digital archives are just going to be a liability. Is that fair?
I think the thing that really struck me in Herman's presentation, and the thing I wrote down immediately, was that costs were a matter of policy or produced by policy. And to some extent, that comes out of your perception of the thing that you're paying for. And so what I was looking at, which is, you know, the value and status of archives, in a sense relates to that whole idea of, you know, what do you think you're paying for, and how do you view this? Do you view this as a liability to be dealt with, or as something of enormous intrinsic value that you know, is worth this sort of sustained investment?
Yep. And the value of the effort involved is that commensurate with the value of the asset as described. I'm not sure we're even close to that sort of a solution to that kind of question yet. There's also a question in my mind that kind of comes out of your paper, James, and I think it is relevant to everyone here as well, about those other people that sort of we need to get involved. So you described, for example, the marketplace and how it's really hard to get the marketplace to become involved. The buyers and sellers of manuscripts of old, as it were, not really having the skills or the capacities to understand. You'll remember as well the previous meeting that we had, we discussed how do we engage the accountancy profession in this question about intangible assets, this kind of IAS 38 question that we've kind of kicked around informally for a wee while now. And I'll tell a story here, if I may, answer my own question by saying we tried quite hard to get the Institute of Chartered Accountants to come today to speak about the evolution of IAS 38. That would have been a knockout presentation. But it's interesting to me that they understood the question I was asking, but deflected and said, look, what this represents actually is something in what historically, or which I've historically understood as being kind of triple bottom line accountancy, where you look at more than just the value of the company, you look at its social and sort of ecological worth, what they now refer to as integrated accounting or integrated reporting, where you look at the whole function and value of a company in an integrated way. So it's not just the bottom line, it is what are you seeking to achieve. But fascinating for me that the accountancy profession effectively then immediately voiced its own concerns about digital preservation. And so far as, you know, how do we validate the data sets that are being sent to us for audit purposes? How do we, you know, previously we would have simply taken a sample of a record set. As an audit, we now can analyse the whole lot. And we can analyse the whole lot, so the kind of the sampling process, effectively the professional skills of the audit profession are rapidly becoming obsolete, because you can assess that whole lot in the cloud using artificial intelligence, and you need a professional cohort 1/10 or 1/20 of the size in order to deliver that. And it's fascinating for me how approaching them about what you know we think of as a professional issue actually opened up to a discussion about their professional concerns and professional issues. I don't really know where I'm going with that, except to say there's a huge dialogue to be had, a much bigger dialogue I think to be had about digital preservation and financial management, financial accounting. We're nowhere close, I think, to having that conversation in a meaningful way. And the research data managers have shown, I think, in the higher education sector, what can be achieved. There's a huge kind of throughput, I think, of other professions and other sectors yet to be represented in this conversation.
I'm conscious sitting here that I conspicuously failed to snag you anyone from the sort of cultural heritage sector, which I said was one of the things I was going to do. It seems to me that there is a moment now, particularly with Arts Council, because their cultural property and collections function is undergoing this review, and digital readiness is at least part of that. because personal digital archives will come through the acceptance in lieu scheme in the next few months or will not. And either of those will be significant. And because, you know, their big slogan at the moment is culture is digital, and at the moment to them that is mainly about digitization,
Yes.
there seems to me to be scope there between us to perhaps do something about that.
To gang up on them.
Yeah, in the nicest possible way. Some
It'll
of
be
my best friends work for the Arts Council.
Will be very, very lovely.
Mhm.
Herman, again, I'm maybe bring you into this too, because you've had experience there with the kind of museum sector, for example, or the gallery sector more broadly, perhaps than would be represented here. Are they, in the Netherlands at least, approachable to the idea that their digital things also have value?
I think yes, but it's difficult because what we discussed today, what is value?
Yep.
When we think about value, we value it about our point of view today.
Yep.
I've worked last year for a new institution in Rotterdam. They have a huge collection about design, architecture,
Yep.
etc. And they want to how say that? I don't know the English word for it, but the collection is really bad, so they have to
Sort of restore it in some way.
Restore it. But you have to make choices on what to restore, because you cannot restore everything, and
Yep.
you can not also digitalize everything.
Yep.
But what are you going to restore, and which objects? And the choose of those objects is made about the perception you have today.
Yep.
But you're going to archive of storage it for infinity. So maybe an object which you won't choose now can be about 10 years is really interesting to restore. So
Yep.
that's really difficult to make the value, and that's I think that's an interesting question, because there are costs, benefits, but also the opinion of people who are restoring digital preservation comes together there. And what's value? And I think, but that's my opinion about accountancy. They are on the back of the project, on the back of the process, because it's just a matter of, can we see it as value, and can we put it on the balance of the institution? Yeah.
Yep.
I think with the example you gave about Facebook, you can make also that example for Amazon. You can make that example for every big institution which is dealing with data. Why not for our sector? So I think it's the question about how we're going to cope with digital preservation. I presented my roadmap, my big arrow. Yeah, the discussion about benefits model is our last step
in the process. Yeah.
But also in the arrow, the largest portion, and which makes it the most difficult one.
Yes.
Because it's more than just costs.
Yes.
Costs are, in perspective, really easy compared to value, benefits, and also social benefits. Because then you have it about intangible assets, intangible benefits.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the phrase, I don't know where it came from today, I'm reminded of a phrase that human problems are always the last ones to be solved. That the engineering, the financial, the business ones can be fixed much more, typically much more quickly, and it's the human ones that are the hardest to solve.
Because it's not tangible, it's intangible.
Exactly. So listen, we'll come up to 4 o'clock. I'm inclined to say we should move on to a brief discussion about next steps. Where do we want to take this kind of research further? I guess Paul has been trapped on his phone call, because I was wanting to draw him into the conversation. That's to say, Paul is, amongst other things, obviously from JISC, has some role in funding. So it was kind of useful for me to have Paul in the room while we discussed what our next steps would be. But maybe what we could do is just have that conversation anyway and present Paul this with a complete list of everything that he needs to fund as ongoing research. So I'll just open the floor to this. I don't make it just a panel.
We are recording the conversation, so we can make him watch it.
Yes. What's the next step?
Hi, Elaine Penn from the University of Westminster. I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of the CCX at all before I went in and had a look at the video. So this is sort of almost to come back to some of the discussion earlier about whether we would use this, is it a good thing? My initial thought was, yeah, this is fantastic. And I started reading some of it up, and then I sort of obviously reached a point where I then needed to log in. And at that point, I, of course, immediately backed off because I thought, I don't understand what that entails. So I would certainly recommend if you gave another presentation of this kind, that we actually had a kind of maybe a demo of it so that we could see what's behind that login before we almost commit to it in some way. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd be really keen to find out more about it. Now, whether that could be done through a webinar where we could sort of get into a test site or something, you know, I don't know, but that would be really interesting to sort of, to understand a bit more about it and what commitment it would have from us as users in order to access things, because that, I wasn't too clear on that basically. So some more stuff about that and actually perhaps a practical demo of it would be, I think, be really helpful. I think that's
certainly something we can do. I mean, it's a community resource, so there's no. I mean, we would make that available to everybody and anybody, DPC members and non-members alike, because we want the most people to use it. Basically,
I mean, so specifically, you would have no objection to setting aside an hour and doing something online for Elaine and for anyone else that wanted to.
And what I'd be interested in seeing is kind of I'd like it to be kind of like an interactive thing as well, where you kind of go, ooh, and what's that do, and what does that do, kind of thing.
Because there would be learning there, wouldn't there? I mean, that would be mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
Something I thought I was having a dig around yesterday when I thought, ooh,
hang on a minute.
Enter your credit card details here.
That's perfectly valid. And what would come of that from our point of view would be to kind of, for you to kind of pick up the bits or the parts of the process that you were kind of concerned with, and see if there was work to be done that could kind of iron out those niggles. So I'd be up for that, and I'd have 2, 3 people on the
four.
Woo,
or more,
cool,
higher. we said we needed an auctioneer.
Oh, great, cool. Right, well, consider it done. Yeah, we'll do that. And going back to kind of research and things that we could possibly do next. All of the things that you were all saying about the data sets themselves and analysing those perhaps over time. Yeah. They are kind of the data sets as you submit them kind of do come kind of with time stamps on them, I suppose. So I don't know how we'd do that. It's other people's data, and we'd have to look at what
I would honestly say is though that there's a substantial data set there.
Yep.
There is almost no analytical function looking at that data.
No.
And it seems to me a straightforward question of getting someone who is sufficiently smart in terms of doing the analysis to actually use that to do some thoughtful analysis of what we know about costs in digital preservation. I mean, that would be a fairly, I wouldn't say it was simple, but one could imagine how that could be done, and one could imagine how that could probably be done given the confidentiality and sensitivity of the data through an appropriate kind of research project.
Yeah.
These things can be done.
So that was one thing I thought, but also it occurred to me that there are another couple of things that we could perhaps do with the CCX to kind of make it a bit easier to kind of see what's inside, is to have something up front that kind of shows you what's on the inside, like a pull through of some graphs and things, so you can see before you commit. It's like what's going to come out, what's going to be spat out the other side. But also we have so I was harping on about how great it was because it would put organisations in touch with other organisations and start conversations, and the context would be revealed and it would all be wonderful. I don't think there's any way we can see how and if that's happening, because it all kind of takes place within the machine itself. So something along those lines to kind of establish how much that's being used and whether that's being used effectively.
So our curation cost exchange speed dating
Speed
event of some
dating
description.
analysis of speed dating results. Yeah, like how many people got married
Yeah,
at the end of it.
I think the way to sort of enhance that a bit will be to benefit from what Herman was saying and add an engagement part to that. So involve some organisations and have some central resource that can go out and help them get some more data in there and help them do some of that analysis and help them talk to each other. That would be the way to learn from both bits of work.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's effectively what you're saying, isn't it? That you kind of wouldn't unless you had somebody there to kind of talk you through it, essentially. And a webinar isn't that, but it's like a step towards that, I guess.
That's really good.
Yes, just to follow up, yes, I think based on, I mean, I didn't read every single page, but
I didn't expect you to. That's
based
fine.
on what I read, that was not sufficient to make me just log in.
Fair enough.
So I think that's my feedback.
No, that's good feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know lots of the organisations that have been focused on are kind of large universities. Are there kind of resources for kind of the really small institutions that don't have huge budgets to cost model on, that do kind of have a smaller pool that they want to kind of look to the future with, apart from the kind of very big organisations that might have more appetite and budget to be able to feed into these conversations? Is the research as relevant to your very small local archive as it is to your much larger organisations with bigger teams?
If I can, I'll jump in there if I may for a kind of field an answer and then see if anyone else can do more specific. So my sense is that one of the reasons why there's a proliferation of cost models is because of the different sizes and functions and natures of organisations. So the question is whether or not that you can pull out the one that is most closely aligned to your own organisational structure and size would be the way to do it. Insofar as that exists, the CCX does at least have a facility, at least in principle, to be able to pick organisations large and small. But whether or not you'll be able to make it to the actual end of the questionnaire, I suppose, is the key issue. Do others on the panel want to comment on that?
The toolkit for SESTA, which I mentioned, was specifically aimed at small archives. They're very wide range. There's a couple of really big ones, DANS, Norway, UK Data Service. They're very large social science archives, but the majority across Europe, they're lucky to have one curator, maybe two. It's very small. So what they can do, and those people are doing everything. So the aim of the toolkit was to give them a short fact sheet on return on investment, what else had been done, give them some of those numbers and figures, what had come out, things like costs of inactivity, ways of thinking about return on investment, which they could pick it up, read it in half an hour, probably apply it in 2 hours, something like that is the aim. So there's a set of fact sheets in that, and then just a couple of very simple tools which they can use. One based on the KRDS benefits framework, which is pre-populated then with a set of things that they can pick and select and adapt for themselves. Another one based on, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. It's it will come to me in a second. Sorry, this is old age. It sneaks up on you. But it's effectively for a planning tool for business planning. And it's been very widely used. That was adapted from being a commercial type thing to into the wording.
Is that eSpider? Is that the one?
No, it isn't. It's the... Damn, it's not going to come immediately. But anyway, it's a commercial tool in commercial language, effectively, as I put it like that. But by switching it a little bit and softening the wording so it applies to things which are non-commercial or have a social purpose rather than commercially driven, it's a very valuable planning tool. So that's there as well. It's been widely used.